Okay, so I'm going to do a video on safe spaces, and in a way, I'll admit it, this is a little bit indulgent because this is me using a video that I'm making in a way partly for my own means to enable me to sort of get my own thoughts in order, I suppose. But if you get anything out of that as a result of that, that isn't a bad thing. Now, this was a video that I was going to knock out last month, but I didn't have time to really get things in the form that I wanted it to be in, so I've left it until now. And so this is where we're at. Now, one thing that it's become apparent to me reading articles and reading things on safe spaces, also listening to people talk about it on YouTube, is that it covers a multitude of sins and people approaching it from several different angles. And there's a lot of different things in there that we're talking about when we're talking about safe spaces. And I mean really safe spaces, mainly with regard to universities and university campuses. So the way that I'm going to structure this is in terms of what I'm going to call three considerations and look at those three different aspects, and also perhaps the way I'm going to propose that one kind of segues into another. And each one of those considerations is going to consider perhaps a tension, okay? And those three tensions or considerations are going to be localized versus campus-wide, physical versus intellectual, and practicality versus ideology, and then maybe a little bit of a summary at the end. So let's crack on and start with localized versus campus-wide. So I think I'm probably starting on fairly uncontentious grounds in that I presume that most people would agree with me when I say that I don't have a problem with localized safe spaces on university campuses. And when I mean a localized safe space, what I mean is a room or a facility maybe managed by very like-minded people with regard to the kind of individuals that would use it, or very empathetic individuals, that provides a kind of intellectual refuge. So if the world's getting a bit too much for you, if you find people are saying things that you find offensive or too challenging, that you can go to that place and get support, or just be on your own and play with the fucking Lego or the little I love you teddy bear that's there, or what have you, right? And I don't think that most people have a problem with that. Why? Because if that's not for you, it isn't going to impact on what you do around the campus, and it's not affecting the sort of intellectual functionality of the university. It's not suppressing any free speech anywhere down the lines. So most people don't have a problem with that. And I propose to you, it's not really a very new idea, although it seems like it, because the term safe space is pretty new. And this idea of safe spaces that function quite along the specific lines that we're talking about is quite a new idea. But I propose that safe spaces have existed on university campuses for as long as university campuses have existed. Oxford and Cambridge are the two oldest universities in the United Kingdom, two of the oldest universities in the world. They've been going on for about 800 years now. And one of the things that they were founded on was the whole business of religion and Christianity, and consequently they are riddled, the whole, I say campuses, they're not really campus-based, they're based around those cities of Oxford and Cambridge. But the colleges that make up those universities are riddled with chapels and places of worship. And what are those chapels and places of worship if they do not function as intellectually safe spaces for people who hold those religious beliefs? After all, elsewhere on the campus, I could challenge a Christian, or a Muslim could challenge a Christian on their beliefs, perhaps make them feel uncomfortable, or say certain things, maybe not intending to be offensive, but which would be offensive to them. But none of those things are going to take place within those chapels. That is effectively a safe space for those people. None of us have a problem with that. Why? Because it's localized, because it doesn't affect those. Effectively, what I'm saying is if they want to go away into their chapel, that's up to them. It isn't affecting what I'm doing in the rest of it. And so this is the divide. This is the tension here between the localized safe space and the campus as a safe space. And this is where the problems, when it bleeds into a campus being a safe space, and this is the one thing that I've talked about when I've made a few videos on no platforming, which is that effectively you've got a total change of circumstance. No platforming is often done on the grounds that it makes students feel unsafe, and effectively the campus should be a safe space. So you've gone from the idea of having this localized safe space where somebody can go to and the rest of the campus is not an intellectually safe space, to say that you have maybe just one lecture theatre on an entire university site that is going to be an especially intellectually unsafe space because you have this contentious speaker, and that is sufficient and so terrible in terms of jeopardizing the safety and sanctity of the space for the whole rest of the university campus that person ought to be no platformed. So this is the kind of change in mentality that we're talking about here. And it isn't just in terms of no platforming speakers, but in terms of forms of segregation across a whole university campus or in other parts of a university campus to try and maintain a safe space. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. The first is from Spiked, The Rise of Safe Space Segregation. Let me read you a little bit about this. And it's talking about segregated dining on an American campus. Unfortunately, university authorities tend to condone this kind of voluntary segregation. For example, Morton Shapiro, the president of Northwestern University, has said that it is understandable that black students eating in a cafeteria would not want white undergraduates to join them. We all deserve safe spaces, he wrote, and black students had every right to enjoy their lunches in peace. I've got to say, from my perspective, the mind boggles about what he means by that last bit. Is there some kind of fucking race war over the dinner table whenever black and white students sit together? I just don't know what that means. But if you read the rest of that article, it then goes on to talk about actually racially segregating housing on university campuses. Something that seems really, really kind of, it's like a throwback to a different era to my ears. And then here's one in the Times. Gay students call for separate flats at universities. This is in the UK. Universities are coming under pressure to offer separate accommodation to lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender undergraduates. Birmingham University already provides an LGBT housing option for first years who do not want to live with heterosexual students. Students at universities across England are now campaigning for the same rights, which they claim avoid any risk of victimisation by straight flatmates. Critics, however, claim it risks ghettoising gay people. And I think you can understand that concern in terms of ghettoising gay people. This kind of mentality is going against the grain of the last few decades, which is that we try to integrate all people together and get on and not segregate people and tear them apart because they all need these little segregated safe spaces. But that is what we're talking about here, safe spaces. And I hope the examples that I've given you there show you the array of things that we can have concern about here and how we can go from this position where we start off accepting safe spaces because what we mean is a safe haven on a university campus for people, to this idea then that the whole university campus needs to function as a safe space in many regards, which then impacts on everything. It means that speakers that are saying things which are controversial, contentious, or some people might find offensive, we simply can't abide on the campus, and then again we use it as an underpinning, as a fundamental underpinning for forms of segregation on the grounds of sexuality or on the grounds of race. Okay, so I think this is something to be concerned because these are very, very different things that we're talking about here. Now, why is this occurring? Well, I think something that gives us a bit of a clue as to why this is occurring is the second grounds of consideration that I want to discuss, and that is physical versus intellectual safe spaces. So I think once again we start from a pretty uncontentious start point, because I think most of us would agree we would want a university campus-wide, to be a physical safe space. We may not be able to guarantee that you can walk around the campus without being sexually or physically assaulted, bludgeoned to death perhaps by somebody with an iron bar. What we would like to do is to try and make every effort that we possibly can to make that university campus as much of a physical safe space as we can. Right, but but that would seem to be entirely apart from the idea of an intellectual safe space, because the idea of a university campus being an intellectually safe space seems to go against the grain of what we understand the university to be about, which is about an organ that is there to challenge the mind, because by challenging the mind, especially at that fundamental part in someone's development, that is how we grow, that is how we nurture the next generation of thinkers, and that is how we have built our societies up. So you would see those two things are two things that are very, very far apart, poles apart in fact. The problem becomes when people start to associate words and statements with acts of violence, and I propose that is part of what is happening here. Let me read you here from a survey that was carried out in the United States last year. Okay, using offensive words is an act of violence according to a majority of students recently surveyed in a nationwide poll. These numbers indicate a growing trend amongst college students to equate using certain words to violence. The nationwide online survey asked 1,000 college students aged 18 to 24 if choosing to use or not use certain words can constitute an act of violence. A majority of respondents, 53%, agreed some words equal violence, with 21% strongly agreeing and 32% somewhat agreeing. So if you carry on reading that article, it gives you some examples, but I think we've all come across this in the news, in either the traditional media or online in the media, of reports where people are using this language of violence to talk about people talking about things. So why is this important? This is why it's important. Because if you start to equate intellectually challenging or offensive words or statements with violence, then you are going to start treating those things the same way that you would treat violence. And we're talking about physical violence, and so we're talking about physical violence on campuses. Ergo, we start to think in terms of a campus-wide safe space. Why? Because we can't allow violence on any part of the campus, could we? What kind of a person would we be if we were to start to do that? So maybe this use of the word violence is done with all the right intentions and it's done in a more innocuous way. But once we start to use this kind of language, then inevitably we're going to start treating intellectual statements in the same way that we start to treat physical assault. And once we start to do that, then universities are going to struggle to fulfill the functions we would expect them to fulfill. Okay, so what underpins all of this? Well, this is where we move on to the third of these three considerations, which is practicality versus ideology. So what I'm hoping is then that getting onto this third consideration of practicality versus ideology, we're starting to winnow it down, starting to get down to brass tacks, get to the nub of the issue of what's underpinning all of this. And I think we need to understand that there is a big difference between safe spaces. He was originally thinking of the idea, which is as some kind of physical space, some kind of pragmatic and practical solution, an empathetic solution to helping people who perhaps need a little bit of respite from the intellectual challenges and perhaps from the offence that they're receiving or that they feel that they're receiving in the wider world. And then this idea of safe space as a mentality being absorbed and spat back out as some kind of ideology. Why? Because once things start to take on an ideological perspective, then they start to get applied far and wide, and that takes on a very, very different aspect. Let me give you an example of just the kind of thing that I mean here and the consequences of that. So I'm going to read you from the Telegraph, and the article is entitled "Student Accused of Violating University Safe Space by Raising Her Hand." A university student was threatened with being thrown out of a meeting after being accused of violating safe space rules by raising her hand. Imogen Wilson, the Vice President for Academic Affairs at Edinburgh University Students' Association, spoke out against safe space rules becoming a tool for the hard left to use when they disagree with people following an incident last week. Ms. Wilson, 22, was subject to a safe space complaint over her supposedly inappropriate hand gestures during a student council meeting. According to the association's rules, student council meetings should be held in a safe space environment, defined as a space which is welcoming and safe and includes the prohibition of discriminatory language and actions. This includes refraining from hand gestures which denote disagreement or in any other way indicating disagreement with a point or points being made. Disagreements should only be evident through the normal course of debate, it says. I have to say that I would have thought that hand waving or shaking your head would be the normal course of debate. But anyway, it goes on. Ms. Wilson says she raised her arms in disagreement after being accused by another speaker of failing to respond to an open letter, despite in fact having made efforts to contact the letter's authors. A complaint was made against Ms. Wilson, who was then subjected to a vote on whether she should be removed from the room. Now, she won that vote, 33 votes to 18. But then she goes on later on. Later on in the meeting, someone threatened me with a second complaint because I was shaking my head. But when I was addressing the room about my worries about Jewish students, there were plenty of people shaking their heads and nothing happened. No shit. I mean, one thing I can say for certain is that there won't be a single person who, hand on heart, can watch this video and say, well, I bet that didn't happen. Because one thing that we know, right, is that whenever you enable people, even if you do it with the best of intentions, people will always misuse it. They will always kind of weaponize it and try and use it to gain leverage, to try and use it in a cynical manner. And this is why we need to be very, very careful, especially when we're talking about things like this that start to impact on free speech issues. And so when we have an example like this, which is a perfect example of this safe space ideology being used in scenarios such as we have here, which is effectively a debating scenario, it can quickly degenerate into just another tool to try and shut people up, to try and close down debate, to try and close down viewpoints that you don't like, or to at least gain some leverage, to at least skew the debate in your favour, not on the grounds of the argument that's being made, but on the grounds of you being able to weaponize those particular tools. And is it any wonder that anything like this is actually happening when attitudes to potentially offensive terms are being changing so dramatically in Western societies? Let me read you some research. This is from the Pew Research Centre. So Pew, of course, a very well established research body. This was part of a global survey that they'd done. I can tell you I'm giving you the data here for the USA, but this was mirrored. They also checked in a lot of other countries, and in other Western countries it was the same kind of figures. Okay, so they've gone with the headline, US Millennials more likely to support censoring offensive statements about minorities, but the actual question, the wording that they asked was this: statements that are offensive to minority groups. Wording very important, and a word on the wording in a minute. Government should be able to prevent people from saying these things. From those earlier generations, you've gone from the mid-20s, you've gone right up to 40%. You're almost at the tipping point there. You're almost at the point where half of that age group are all in favour of government censoring our statements. Okay, so two things that I want to say. The first that is very important is notice what is being asked here. It's not talking about words. It's not saying that there are certain words that we should proscribe, that we should stop people saying. Don't say fag, don't say nigger. You can make your points, but don't use these words. No, we're talking about statements, not words. And statements are the way that we get our ideas across. Without statements, we cannot make our ideas. When you censor statements, effectively what you are doing is you are dismissing some ideas from the table and saying these are ideas that we cannot even discuss publicly at all. The government should stop us even attempting to discuss these particular ideas, or at least these ideas with these particular perspectives involved. That is a really, really serious thing to say there, and that's a very dangerous path I propose to go down. The other things that I want to say here is when I read things like this, I really want to go to that 40% and say to them, okay, so that's what you believe, that the government should be able to prevent people from making these statements. So tell me, with regard to yourself, right, how many statements is that going to stop you from saying, right? How many statements that you make are going to fall foul of these? Because I get the sense that it comes from a sort of assumed privilege, that when people who are prepared to sign up to these things and put their name to this kind of censoriousness always feel that it isn't going to apply to them, that they're on the right side of it, so it's all absolutely fine. And I wonder whether they'd be quite so keen if they didn't feel that they're always going to end up on the right side of it. And actually some of the things that they believe in their heart and that they really want to be able to argue and debate and to be able to talk about would fall foul of this kind of thing. We talk about privilege and blindness. If this isn't an example of privilege blindness, I don't know what is. But this kind of attitude is creeping in, and I think it's this kind of attitude that underpins a lot of this kind of expansion of safe space. Okay, so maybe it's time to make a summary. Okay, so what I'm not going to do in this summary is what you're supposed to do in a summary, which is to summarise what you've already said. Don't say anything new, but just say what you've already said in a more condensed form. But that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to assume that that's all still fresh in your head and try and piece it together. Because I think you can see that when you put all these different bits together, okay, this idea of the university campus as a space that is safe from violence, but then put that alongside this idea that words and speech acts can be violence. They can be regarded as violence. And then take this idea of safe spaces that result as an ideology and not just as discrete physical spaces. And then you can maybe see where this perspective is arriving from, that effectively not making a whole campus, not making the refectory, not making other common spaces, not making the lecture hall safe spaces, is effectively shitting on marginalised people. You're not taking their concerns. You're not interested in their well-being, right? If you start to piece all these things together. The fact is that nothing can be further from the truth, right? I have genuine concern for marginalised people, people that don't have as much of a voice as they ought to have, or people that are discriminated against and people that get a really shit time in our society. But I'm afraid that there's something that's even more critical to me, that's even more critical of a concern, and that is not disappearing down some kind of authoritarian rabbit hole, perhaps a rabbit hole that's paved with good intentions, but a rabbit hole nonetheless, and a rabbit hole that there may be no easy way of getting out from. And once you start to limit people, snip away at people's rights to make statements, once you start to take away that intellectual freedom that you would expect to see on a university campus and start applying safe space ideology across the campus, it might make it a much more comfy, more pleasant, less challenging experience for some people, and that might be a good thing for them. But it's a very, very dangerous thing to do, taking the larger picture into account. I will say that, I made a video on Jordan Peterson recently, and I had some criticisms specifically with regards to Bill C-16 in Canada. But this is one concern that he highlights, not quite the same wording that I've done it, but the same kind of concern that he highlights in a lot of his talks, and this is something that I absolutely agree with him about, and this is something that I think is a genuine concern. Okay, so that's what I think about safe spaces, and that's where we're at. Interested to know what you think. Please leave a comment. Why not make a video response, you lazy wankers? Thank you for watching. Bye for now.